Welcome to the deep dive. We are diving into a stack of sources you, our curious listener, have sent our way. Our mission today is, well, to sift through them together.
Exactly. Pull out the key ideas, maybe some surprising bits.
The stuff that makes you feel a little more clued in.
Think of us as your guides, navigating this landscape you've laid out.
Precisely. And for this dive, we have two articles. They're both from the same author, Jorge Pires, PhD.
Published pretty recently, too, in a place called Scientists Free from Religion.
Right. And they offer a critical look at spirituality, religion, often using Sam Harris as a reference point.
Yeah, Harris's work comes up quite a bit as a starting point for the author's argument.
Okay, let's unpack this. So the first article we're tackling is called How Come Eastern and Western Seems to Be on Opposite Sides? Critique on Sam Harris.
Mm-hmm.
And interestingly, the author starts off by saying he really admires Sam Harris.
Yeah, he makes that clear. Says it's a critique, offered in good faith, not some kind of attack.
Which is a good way to start, I think.
It sets a certain tone. And then he gets right into this core tension he spots in Harris's book, Waking Up.
A tension between two different statements Harris makes.
Exactly. They seem to pull in opposite directions. So, on one side, Harris has this really clever line. He flips that old cultural cliche.
Oh, the one about medicine?
That's the one. Mm-hmm. He says the difference between Eastern and Western spirituality is like the difference in medicine, but the arrow of embarrassment points the other way.
Meaning the West should maybe feel a bit embarrassed about its spiritual side compared to the East.
That's the implication, yeah. Acknowledging some depth there, some sophistication in Eastern traditions.
Okay, so that's one side.
But then the author points out, just a few pages later, Harris drops this huge generalization. He says something like, humanity did not understand the biology of cancer under an Eastern sun. And then finishes with, the rest is instinct, folklore, bewilderment, and untimely death.
Wow, okay, that's quite a shift. From acknowledging depth to basically dismissing everything else as folklore and death.
It is. And the author's question is basically, whoa, what just happened there? How do you square those two things?
Yeah.
Pires, the author, sort of speculates why educated Westerners might turn eastward for spirituality. Mm-hmm. His thought is maybe the West, despite all its science, really struggles with the inner life.
Good at tools, maybe not so good at wisdom? Is that the idea?
Kind of. That's how Pires frames it. He contrasts this with his view of Christianity, which he sees as more about faith and submission, not necessarily deep self-exploration, which he thinks might explain why the West maybe didn't explore that inner world as much historically.
Interesting take. He also challenges the idea of science being purely Western, right?
He does. He concedes modern science, emerged historically in the West. But he argues science is fundamentally a method.
A way of doing things, not a cultural property.
Exactly. A method anyone can adopt anywhere in the world. It's not owned by a civilization.
And he gives examples.
Yeah. The source mentions artemisinin, that anti-malarial drug. Came from traditional Chinese medicine.
Right, a major contribution.
And things like mindfulness meditation, breathing techniques. Stuff from Eastern traditions now being studied and validated by Western neuroscience.
So to just write it all off as folklore and death seems, well, it ignores that whole process of exchange and integration.
That's his point. It's applying a simple black and white view to something really complex and messy.
He even notes the irony, doesn't he, that Harris's own book, Waking Up, leans so heavily on Eastern practices.
He does. Buddhism, meditation. Harris spent a lot of time with that. So Pires suggests the West is, in some ways, still playing catch-up spiritually.
He does briefly mention Christopher Hitchens, too.
Just to contrast, Hitchens was famously much harsher, like with the Dalai Lama. Pires notes Harris isn't quite as sweepingly critical as Hitchens was.
Okay. So wrapping up this first article, the author's final thought is really about moving beyond this whole East versus West thing.
Yeah, fundamentally. He argues the real problem is sticking to that dualism. The important task isn't deciding who's better, but figuring out how to integrate the best bits from everywhere.
But with critical thinking.
Absolutely. With skepticism, rigor, and humility. And he actually thinks Harris himself would probably agree with that approach, the integration part at least.
Okay, that gives us a really clear picture of his critique regarding Harris and the East-West comparison. Let's shift to the second article now, by the same author.
Sure. This one's called The Christian Trick of Making God Abstract and Hard to Define. Nice try, Sam Harris.
Intriguing title. What's the trick he's talking about here?
He's looking at a trend he sees in Christian apologetics.
Oh.
It's this move to redefine God.
Away from the traditional image.
Exactly. Away from the, old man with a beard in the sky idea towards something much more abstract. God as the mystery of the universe or the ground of being, or even something like Spinoza's God, where God and the universe are basically the same thing.
And why does Pires think this is happening?
He sees it as a strategy, essentially. A way to make Christian belief seem more compatible with modern science and rational thought.
Make it harder to criticize.
That's the idea. If God is super abstract, super vague, how do you even argue against it? How do you disprove the mystery of the universe?
This sounds like what he calls the Spinoza God bait and switch. Can you unpack that?
Yeah, that's his key phrase for it. The bait, according to Pires, is when believers, facing challenges, bring up these sophisticated, abstract, non-interventionist ideas of God.
Like Spinoza's God who doesn't answer prayers or do miracles.
Right. The bait sounds intellectual, hard to refute. But then comes the switch.
Which is?
The switch, Pires argues, is that these very same people, in their personal lives and often in their communities, still seem to believe in the traditional God. The one who does listen to prayers, who intervenes, who cares about individuals, performs miracles, all that stuff.
But a Spinoza-like God wouldn't do any of that.
Precisely. So the author sees a contradiction. He calls it a theological sleight of hand.
A way to sound modern while holding on to old beliefs.
That's his interpretation. A rhetorical escape hatch, he calls it, projecting intellectualism while keeping the comfort of the personal interventionist God.
And he argues this works because it makes belief unfalsifiable.
That's a huge part of it. Try to critique the traditional God and they can just pivot, oh, but my God is just the mystery of existence.
So the definition keeps shifting.
Exactly. It makes the target too vague to hit, while Pires suggests they privately keep the comforting bits. He mentions someone like Jordan Peterson, who talks about God often in psychological or metaphorical ways.
Tapping into that desire for meaning without literal dogma.
Right. Pires sees this as keeping the religious impulse alive, as he puts it, by making God abstract.
What does Pires see as the hidden danger here?
Well, he outlines a few things. First, he thinks it lets the idea of God survive intellectually, where in his view it should have faded. It keeps people tethered to faith, he says.
Prevents a move towards secularism, maybe?
That seems to be his concern. Second, he thinks it lets people defend religion using intellectual-sounding language. But the function is the same as old-school belief.
And it makes criticism harder.
Definitely. If God is everywhere and nowhere, how do critics even engage? He calls it a shell game. The definition just moves around.
And the overall result, in his view?
It's a survival tactic for religion. It helps it stay relevant, culturally influential, even as society becomes more secular.
He even offers a kind of test, doesn't he?
Yeah, sort of practical test. If someone says their God is just the universe or something abstract, Pires suggests asking them, do you pray to this God? Do you think it listens or intervenes?
And if they say yes?
Then, Pires concludes, you're probably just dealing with the same old traditional God, just dressed up in fancier language. He even shares a quick story about a friend getting really awkward trying to answer that.
He calls this cognitive dissonance, right? Holding two conflicting ideas.
Exactly. The abstract, impersonal force idea and the personal, caring, miracle-working God idea. He argues you can't logically hold both simultaneously. It doesn't stand up to scrutiny.
And he contrasts all this with how science works.
Right. He points out that traditional religion often deals in certainty, God's will, divine truth. And even this abstract God, he argues, often functions as a kind of ultimate certain explanation.
Certainty dressed in humble clothing was the phrase.
That's it. Whereas science, he emphasizes, thrives on uncertainty.
On questioning everything.
Yes. Questioning, testing, being ready to be wrong, constantly updating based on evidence. That, for Pires, is real intellectual humility, unlike the hidden certainty he sees in even the abstract God concepts.
So his final take on this abstract God strategy?
He basically concludes it's an empty tactic. It sounds deep, but it's mostly a label put on the unknown to protect faith from hard questions.
A defense mechanism.
A smoke and mirrors trick. A strategic retreat for belief in an age of reason. And he sees it as dangerous because it helps the concept of God survive and retain influence, even if it alienates some believers who want something more concrete.
It's a pretty strong critique of that specific apologetic approach. So, wrapping up our deep dive today, we've explored these two really interesting articles by Jorge Pires. First, his critique of Sam Harris on East versus West.
Yeah, looking at that tension and the complexities of how ideas cross cultures.
And then his breakdown of the abstract God strategy in Christian apologetics.
Analyzing it as a way to make belief seem unfalsifiable, to help it survive, in our modern, more secular world, despite what he sees as contradictions.
Both articles really show his skeptical approach, don't they? Pointing out contradictions, looking at the rhetoric.
Definitely. Applying that critical lens to religious and spiritual claims, especially when they bump up against science and modern philosophy.
And remember, all this analysis came directly from the sources you, the listener, sent in. Shows what a deep dive can uncover.
It really does. It brings up some big questions, I think, about how ideas change or resist change. How much things like comfort and certainty play into what we believe.
And how we even evaluate these huge claims about reality when the words themselves become so slippery.
So maybe something for you, our listener, to think about is this. When we talk about things like God or consciousness or ultimate reality using really abstract terms, does that abstraction protect the idea? Or does it just make it kind of empty?
A good question to ponder. Until next time.